Anna here, New Hampshire Community Supported Research. It is winter time and we are planning our potential field trials for this upcoming growing season. While I'm reviewing the literature, figuring out what the key pests and diseases are that are affecting our commercial growers, I thought it would be a great opportunity to put together a kind of beginner's guide to what could possibly go wrong when you are growing, in this case, kale, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, all these brassica vegetable crops. I may be an expert in pest management, but I am not an expert grower, so I could certainly use the brush up on how to grow these crops. Now for this video, I am focusing on kale specifically. Pests and diseases of all of these different vegetable crops are all pretty similar. They are all the same plant species, which is kind of crazy if you think about it. Here is a diagram from Ontario's grower guide where you start with transplants of broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower. They all look exactly the same when they're young because they're all the same species of plant, but the different varieties will do very different things as it grows. We are breeding broccoli for these flowers. We don't let them go all the way to flowering. This is just the inflorescence that we cut off, and the inflorescence is really delicious. Cabbage, the same thing. It is bred to produce a head. All those leaves will curl up into a head that we cut up. That's also very delicious. Cauliflower, that's also a flower, just the inflorescence. We breed for this interesting thing that we call a curd. Now keep in mind, newer varieties of cauliflower are self-blanching or self-wrapping, but before they bred those varieties, you would have to wrap up those white heads with the leaves to protect it from the sunlight. This keeps that cauliflower curd from discoloring. So if you want to have nice white cauliflower, you would have to wrap that up or select self-blanching or self-wrapping heads of cauliflower. That's a very interesting thing. Here is a diagram of Brussels sprouts. Another wild card here, same species, different variety that grows really tall and has balls all over its sides. Evolution. But like I say, for this, I'm going to primarily focus on kale. It is going to tell you the same story, pest and disease-wise, because all of these different crops that are the same species are going to have really similar pests and diseases. Also, kale is the most beginner-friendly crop of all of these. Also, you can get the most bang for your buck space-wise. If you grow one broccoli plant, you get one crown of broccoli after several weeks. For kale, you have kind of a continuous supply of green leafy vegetables. They're delicious. You can continually harvest leaves from the base. Take a look at this photo. These are kale plants growing inside a high tunnel. A high tunnel is kind of like an unheated greenhouse, unlike a greenhouse where you have like a cement floor, you're growing right in the ground. You'll see there's snow on top of here. This is a picture taken in, I think this was January or February, but that's an outrageous kale plant that has been harvested, and that's something that you can do too if you had an environment to do it. These plants, unlike lettuce that really can't tolerate freezing temperatures, brassicas can tolerate several hours of freezing temperatures. And speaking of freezing temperatures, not only can kale and the other brassicas tolerate freezing temperatures, it actually makes them more delicious. The plant will protect itself from ice crystals forming in its cells and breaking apart its cells by accumulating sugars. Those sugars act as an antifreeze to keep those ice crystals from forming, which makes it a more delicious vegetable. Also, it triggers the plant to ease off a little bit on their chemical defense. So brassicas produce something called glucosinolates. It's a family of chemical compounds that is what makes spicy mustard spicy. So if you think about horseradish, mustard greens, they produce some very spicy glucosinolates. A frost-sweetened broccoli or kale, it is producing the friendlier version of those sulfur-containing compounds because it doesn't need it during the winter times. If you are on the fence about brassicas in general, try a frost-sweetened brassica. Grow these through the fall for yourself. If you have a winter farmer's market, there are local growers producing these frost-sweetened vegetables throughout the winter. All right, so this video is broken down into stages. pre-planting stage, post-planting, vegetative growth for kale. This is also harvest. And I'm going to do a little bit about physiological disorders affecting broccoli and cabbage. So you can jump to those time points if that's what you're dealing with. I've included a little bit of details about whether or not you're doing spring planting or fall planting. These are cool season crops. You're probably not going to do like dead in the middle of the summer because they don't like the heat. Okay, here's the New England Vegetable Management Guide, and this is the cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, and other brassica crops. You'll see like broken down some disease control and insect control recommendations. And here again, they point out that if you're talking about broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, kale, kohlrabi, they're all Brassica oleracea. There are some other vegetables that we're familiar with, like Chinese cabbage, mustards, bok choy. They are different species, but they're all Brassica. They also call them cole crops or cruciferous crops. They're from all over the way, but they're well adapted. So the guide goes through different recommendations for cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, some variety recommendations. And again, they break out their variety recommendations based on whether or not you're planting them in the spring or for the fall. I think the distinction there is probably which ones do best in high heat. So if you're planting a fall crop, you're planting in the late summer. So you want something that can do well with heat. So soil fertility, they say apply lime according to soil tests to maintain a soil pH of 6.5 to 6.8. They mention calcium right up front. We're going to talk about that. They also mention that brassica crops are sensitive to boron deficiency. We'll talk about that. And then they give you some recommendations about preparing transplants. Aside from a few exceptions that are mentioned in the guide, you're going to start brassica crops from a transplant, right? You're going to give them a jump start, especially in the springtime. Some of the exceptions were some of the more tender leafy greens, the Asian varieties that you might find in like a baby greens mix. We're talking about Mizuna, pak choys, things like that. They tend not to deal with the stress of transplanting very well. They're more apt to bolt or flower or have weird physiological changes. But for kale, you're probably going to want to start from a transplant. I think most commercial farmers will do that because they might have a historical problem with soil-borne disease. And this is something that the guide mentions is like clubroot and blackfoot and weird stuff like that. If you're starting out fresh, chances are very slim that you're going to come across these soil-borne diseases. So I wouldn't worry about that. It is nice to have a jump on the season. According to the guide, transplants should be about 5 to 7 weeks old. If you're growing them in a cold frame or a sunroom or a greenhouse, you're talking about minimum nighttime temperatures of at least 50 degrees. Excessive cold, rapid changes in temperature, transplant stress, inadequate fertility. These are all things that can cause weird physiological problems during planting. Speaking of that, let's take a moment to talk about etiolation. All right, when I'm talking about etiolation, I'm talking about a plant's response to low light conditions. So if you think about this from an evolutionary point of view, this is like a baby plant coming out of a seed and it is being shaded out by something else. What it's trying to do is stretch it up as high as possible to get past like that other plant that is shading it out. You see this diagram is saying, red light keeps it right there. It's just fine where it is. In dark situations, it's going to stretch. We often call this legginess. So here's some leggy broccoli transplants. If they look like this at this stage, you're probably not going to be able to fix this situation. This might be something you need to start over and find better light. Sometimes you'll see some situations where you plant them, they start getting a little bit leggy, a little bit stretched out. Here's an example of that. That means that they're probably in a low light condition and they're just not going to do very well there. Nothing you can do about that but start over, unfortunately. Knowing this, there's certainly some things you can do inside. Brassica sprouts, this is something you can just do in a jar. Bean sprouts, things like that. They don't need light and they're kind of delicious. broccoli sprouts. You can do that at home. This is different from microgreens, which is grown under high light conditions inside, but much denser, and they're harvested immediately after they sprout out. While I'm talking about etiolation, I want to show you some cute pictures of cacti. Maybe you've had a beautiful round cactus and you take it home and it grows weird like that. That's because it's in a lower light condition than it's used to. So you'll see etiolation happening in all sorts of different plant situations. Ugh, how cute. All right, so growing transplants in your house, chances are pretty good that just putting it next to a window isn't going to be enough light. If you have a sunroom, if you have a situation where it's warm enough at night above 50 degrees and sunlight during the day for most of the day, that's pretty good. Otherwise, you can buy transplants at the garden center. All right, so we're ready to plant. So like I said, brassicas can tolerate some cold temperatures. If you have an unexpected cold snap in the springtime, no problem. Also keep in mind that cooler temperatures mean slower growth. Keep that in mind for expectations. This can also mean that young plants are getting going during cool, wet conditions that could be conducive to some of the soil-borne fungal pathogens that are mentioned in the guide. Without a history of growing brassicas in your garden, I kind of doubt this is something for you to be worried about. I would also guess the same thing for cabbage maggot. This is a fly that lays its eggs at the base of brassica plants. Their larvae can do some damage in their root system, which, the plants will look kind of bad, and you'll look below the soil and you'll find these like little white maggoty things. That could happen. But again, if you don't have a history of brassicas, I wouldn't expect this to happen. For fall planted kale or kale planted in the summer for growing through the fall, you can direct seed or use transplants. You're less likely to have a problem with slow growth. As long as you have soil with good drainage, and by good drainage, I mean there's not so much standing water on the ground after you water, you probably don't have to worry about anything during the planting stage. All right, now we're in vegetative growth. Something they talk a lot about is bolting. Bolting is that physiological change from vegetative growth to reproductive growth in a plant. So stress in general will trigger plants to switch from growing leaves to growing up much taller and producing flowers and seeds. It thinks it's going to die. Something about nature that makes plants and some insects, they think they're going to die. The first thing they do is try to reproduce. This is the crazy thing about nature. All right, so if you have good nutrition, if you haven't stressed out your plants, they have enough light where they're growing, you're putting on some good growth, you have a bunch of leaves coming out, and you have the older leaves, the leaves at the bottom are getting big enough that you might like to eat them. Congratulations, you're done. We're ready for harvest. And we're going to continue to grow and harvest as that plant grows. Here are some other problems you might notice. Something that the guide mentions is tip burn, and this might be from a calcium deficiency or a boron deficiency. You'll see some yellowing and some browning, things like that. Tip burn is caused by inadequate transport of calcium to rapidly growing tissues. That could be lack of calcium in the soil, but it also is related to high nitrogen levels that cause lots of fast growth in large outer leaves. That makes calcium accumulate in larger outer leaves at the expense of the young expanding leaves. So that's why you see them where they are. So thinking about what you can do to improve your soil to avoid this next year, you can certainly add more organic matter. That always helps with mediating nitrogen availability and making sure there's not too much too fast. You can also think about adding calcium to your soil to mitigate this. Keep in mind that most things that you could have added or should add for next year to your soil to improve calcium will also raise soil pH. We're talking about garden lime, bone meal, eggshells, hardwood ashes, things like that. The one exception is gypsum. That will not raise your soil pH, but this would be great if you need to raise your soil pH anyway. The guide says 6.5 to 6.8. So another reason to have your soil tested. But how do you distinguish nutritional problems like this from like a fungal disease like Alternaria leaf spot? Here is a guide from Cornell's vegetable team about Alternaria leaf spot of brassicas. Alternaria is caused by a fungal pathogen. Here's a nice microscopic view of fungal pathogens. The symptoms, at first glance, are kind of similar. You might see some yellowing, you might see some brown leaves. They make a point that black fungal growth, these are spores from the fungal growth, will appear on cabbage leaves, so kind of like a sooty black appearance. Alternaria will show up on cauliflower curds. That's a sign, this black sooty stuff, black specks. Also, this target spot with concentric rings is a giveaway that this is a fungal disease and not a nutritional problem. They provide some information about how the pathogen spreads. Commercial farmers will often rely on fungicides to prevent pathogen outbreaks like this, but what I will guess from home gardeners is it's very unlikely that you'll have any kind of problems with this kind of fungi unless you have a really long history of growing brassicas at this spot. Another dead giveaway that you're talking about a nutritional problem versus Alternaria specifically is that Alternaria will be seen on older, lower leaves first, which is the opposite of that tip burn that we were talking about, which is noticed on younger leaves first. So keep that in mind. So my best friend and urban gardener, Dawn Weber, often reminds folks in these new isolated gardens that we benefit from a lack of pests and disease because they haven't found your garden yet. But at the same time, natural enemies, the ones that have those special evolutionary relationships and can help us control our pests, sometimes they take a while to find our garden too. So long story short, you kind of never know what to expect. These pests are very good at finding their hosts, the insect pests, and the natural enemies that attack the pests. They're pretty good at finding their hosts too, but they tend to be a little bit smaller and it might take them a little bit longer. I'm pretty certain that your kale will attract the attention of one or more members of the Brassica lepidopteran complex. These are the caterpillars that are really good at seeking out their hosts. They smell a brassica from a mile away. You might have already seen this butterfly. This is a Pieris butterfly, cabbage white, cabbage sulfur, or imported cabbage worm. They lay eggs on kale plants, and their babies are these green caterpillars. What you're not likely to see are the other moth species that lay their eggs on your plants at night, but you might notice big holes chewed by other caterpillar species like the cabbage looper, diamondback moth, cross-striped cabbage worm. There are a ton of species that you might find on your plants. You'll see big holes, or often what we call window painting. This is where, a smaller caterpillar is feeding on the undersides of leaves, but doesn't chew all the way through. Commercial growers generally refer to all these caterpillars as a complex because they're managed pretty much the same way. You can pick these guys off by hand. So give a scout, go take a look at the undersides of leaves to find these caterpillars and take them off, throw them in a bucket of soapy water if you think they're gross. But you can certainly consider using a BT product. That's short for Bacillus thuringiensis. There's several species of BT. The ones that are labeled for caterpillars are specifically for this group of insects, right? So you can find these products at any garden center or hardware store. Look for caterpillar on the label. It'll do a really nice job of controlling your caterpillars, especially when they're young, but it won't hurt the natural enemies that are helping you do the job of managing these pests. This also means that these BT products cannot control the other pest groups that might be causing problems in your kale. Especially here in the Northeast, we have crucifer flea beetles. They cause more of like shot hole damage. So you'll see lots and lots of little holes peppered through leaves. In the mid-Atlantic and southern parts of North America, we have harlequin bug. This is near and dear to my heart. It was my PhD bug, so you'll see it over my shoulder. You'll see it in artwork made by loved ones. This is a piercing sucking feeder causing like this cloudy damage. We won't see it so much in the Northeast. They don't like the cold weather. Later on in the year, you might encounter cabbage aphids. Some folks call these ladies gray aphids because they have a gray cast to them compared to other aphid species. they're covered in this waxy substance. They actually produce this wax, and it provides extra protection from natural enemies that other aphid species don't have. All aphids are incredibly cold hardy, so you'll definitely see other aphid species this time of year, but these gray aphids, these cabbage aphids, are particularly well defended from the parasitoids that we were talking about before. You can just rub them off with your fingers if you don't think that's gross. If you want to look at the garden center, there's something called Safer soap. If it gets on the aphid body, it disrupts that wax. It disrupts their skin, and it can kill them. Dr. Bronner's, as long as it's unscented, could be an alternative for that. It's like that old-fashioned Castile soap that does a really good job of killing insects as long as you can smother them. All right, so I will just brush over some physiological disorders for some of these heading crops. Kind of hard to really understand what causes some of these physiological disorders, because if you look at the literature, they kind of say stress, right? So high heat, low heat, extreme heat, this, that, and the other thing. But there are a few things that you should recognize as things that are physiological and not caused by diseases. The guide mentions buttoning in broccoli, and this is essentially when broccoli elongates. You have a loose flowering pattern. They'll say it's caused by plants that are not big enough to support flowering, so they don't have enough leaf tissue, like the powerhouse of the plant. That's one thing that can cause buttoning. Bracts. This is kind of these extra leaves that you see on the side of broccoli crowns. Some physiological stress will cause that flower to be more leaves than inflorescence, and that's not super tasty. Brown beading. This might be something to distinguish between brown beading and alternaria head rot that happens in the head. So these brown beads can sometimes be caused by high heat, by stress. Sometimes it's caused by a fungus. I think the distinction is to look for those black specks that we were looking at before. If you don't see much black, it's probably a physiological response. This is versus yellow beading, which is probably caused by that flower being too mature, like maybe you waited too long to harvest it and it started flowering. That's probably yellow beading or high heat stress. So once you get into the heat of the summer, you'll see more yellow beading. Edema, this is a fun one. This is going to happen when you have really big changes in humidity, and you'll see these kind of warts developing on the undersides of cabbage leaves. That's a physiological response. This is cauliflower curding. I think this is just stress that makes that cauliflower head separate and not have that nice dense curd. And of course you have broccoli hollow stem. This could be a bunch of different things. This could be temperature. It could be boron deficiencies, but I think this is pretty common. I mean, there's not too many times I brought broccoli home from the grocery store and not noticed that stem kind of hollowing out, but these are physiological responses. All right, so those are the most common problems that I have identified, but we're probably just scratching the surface. Let me know if you agree or disagree. What else do you want to know more about? Leave a comment, and thank you for listening.